Today I'm taking some garden staples and turning them into a long-term food prep to serve my crew when time is tight. I will also share a tip on cutting your food budget by better utilizing pantry staples, and we'll bring it all home with a sneak peek at the finished product. In years past, I've stuck to ingredient canning. It felt safe and versatile, but now that the process of canning has become so automatic, canning meal preps and meals in a jar has been a lifesaver for times when I don't feel like cooking a big meal. Today's plan is Sloppy Joe Starter. Once complete, this recipe added to a pound of ground beef turns into a 5-minute meal, depending on the size you choose, of course, and it's pretty simple to get into the jar. To get started, this recipe calls for 4 cups of chopped peppers, half red and half green, as well as 2 cups of diced red onions. Because my goal is to can up the produce that I grow in my own garden, I'm using a white onion as well as all green peppers. This will change the color of my final product just slightly, but as you'll see in the end, it still turns out really, really beautifully. My pepper plants were absolutely loaded when the first frost threatened this year, so I had an abundance of green peppers to process. I turned many of them into strips for fajitas, but also chopped a lot of them, which is what we're using up today. To speed this along, I just ran them through my food processor until they were as small as I had in mind, and then verified the measurements, of course, before tossing them onto a sheet pan for roasting. With the excess onion, I put it in a freezer-safe container and into the freezer for future meal prep use. I used to toss it in the fridge, but then I would usually find it a few weeks later pushed to the back, so they ended up getting composted. Once I started tossing them into the freezer, I cut the amount of onions that I needed to purchase each month by about a third. It's a seemingly tiny change, but it was a really nice help for my kitchen. Now, with the extras tucked away, it was time to get all the peppers and onions that we're using for today's project into the oven. Now, my goal on canning project days is always to use as few dishes as humanly possible. So, of course, I attempted to put all of these out on one sheet pan. I quickly realized that was not going to work at all because I did want them evenly roasted in order to develop the flavor. So I did pull out the second pan to make sure to get them all spread out. Now, once that's done, you do have to make sure you get them seasoned up. So salt and pepper go onto both trays before they head over to the oven to roast until they started to brown around the edges just slightly. Now, while I finish up with the onions and the peppers, I wanted to take just a minute to say thank you again to Lisa over at Sutton's Days, as well as to 4 Jars for sponsoring Canuary 2025. Without them, I would not have met so many of you in the last few weeks. I appreciate all of your kind words, the new subscribers, and also the canning tips that have been shared in the comments for my first upload on pork carnitas. As we round the corner and approach the end of Canuary 2025, I wanted to take a minute to remind you that there is still time to watch all of the Canuary uploads. I'll make sure to link them again down in the comments. Make sure to like and comment so you can get entered to win the awesome prizes given away by Lisa as well as 4 Jars. So thank you again to both of them for sponsoring this year's Canuary 2025. Now, jumping back to the peppers and onions, they've been in the oven for about 10 minutes now at 375. I pulled them out and made sure to flip them so they got a really even browning on all sides. And this is really important to help develop the flavor in the finished product. So make sure not to cut them short. After you get them flipped back over, they need to go back in the oven for another 10 minutes. So a total of 20 minutes in the oven or until the edges start to get slightly brown on the sides. Once the peppers and onions are roasted until the appropriate doneness, you just pull them out and you're going to scrape both of those pans right into another vessel on the stovetop. This point, all you need is those roasted peppers and onions plus a half cup of tomato paste. Now, you can use a store-bought paste, but there are also directions in the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving that tell you how to make a really beautiful roasted tomato paste. Now, I looked at those directions and realized this was absolutely so simple that there was no good reason why I shouldn't just make this at home from some of the tomato sauce that I already had on the shelf. You see, where I live, I can't just go to the store and pick up an organic tomato paste or anything of the sort. I'm going to get just what's available on the shelf, and what I have in my pantry is of a higher quality because of the way I garden. With that being said, it was a no-brainer to make my own. It really just took a few hours on the stove boiling it down, and the recipe that's in this book on page 206 also tells you that you can also make the paste by spreading it out on a sheet pan and roasting it in the oven, just stirring occasionally until you get the thickness that you like. So if you haven't ever made tomato paste in the past, definitely check it out. It's not as hard as you'd think, and just another great way to go ahead and use some of that tomato sauce that you probably have sitting on your shelf. Now, getting back to the vegetables, it just needs a couple minutes to really cook down and thicken up. Now, if you're using a store-bought paste, it might not need as much of a time because you're going to get a really thick product to begin with, but that oven roasted paste did have a little bit of water left, so this was a great time to cook it out. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get my canner ready for this water bath recipe. Now, a water bath canner is really nothing more than any vessel that can boil water and cover with at least 1 inch of water. This makes water bath canning really perfect place to start for all of you who may be new to the canning process. You do need to make sure that your jars have some sort of rack to lift them off the bottom, but there are other ways around that which you can find hacks for online if you don't have an actual rack to go in the bottom. At my house today, I have a lot going on, so I'm using my digital canner because it allows me to be just a bit more hands-off than one would on the stove. So I'm putting my jars in, adding 3 quarts of water, which is to the fill line inside when warming, and then putting some water inside those jars so they can get properly warmed up while I finish the recipe. Once my canner has the jars warmed, it will beep at me to let me know anytime I'm ready to go ahead and fill them up. Now, I just used a jar opener, which is one of my all-time favorite little kitchen hacks once you are using home canned food. They're not as easy to open as you might think, and I hurt my hand a few too many times before I decided to just invest in that little pry tool to help pop up those lids. That is something that 4Jars actually offers, so if you're checking them out, make sure to pick one of those up. It will make your life way easier. In the meantime, I started putting the rest of the ingredients in. So this one takes 4 cups of tomato sauce, which was my home can that I just showed you, as well as 1 cup of apple cider vinegar that has 5% acidity. This means it needs to be one that's purchased from the store, not one that you made at home. Also put 1/2 cup of Dijon mustard, and now I'm making a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. This is one of my favorite hacks to add versatility to my kitchen and cut down the number of products that I have to buy. What I did here was take a 1/4 cup of sugar, added a little bit of molasses, and I'm giving it a good stir. If you have regular sugar, there's no need to purchase brown sugar. This method prevents you from ever having a rock hard box of brown sugar when you are ready to go with a recipe. It also cuts down on the number of items that you have to buy, and both of those ingredients last a very long time. The super cool thing is it takes the question out of how much is a fully packed cup of brown sugar. So I took a 1/4 cup to begin with, added a little bit of molasses, threw it back in my measuring cup just to verify for your purposes, and it was exactly perfect for that fully packed cup of brown sugar necessary for the recipe. Now all I have to do is throw it in the pan. This does work, by the way, if you want to make up a little in advance, if you want to save yourself some time. But I usually don't make up too much in advance because I love the ability to stay flexible and also to make sure that it doesn't go bad while it's waiting on me to figure out what I want to do with it on the shelf. Now, once all the ingredients are added in, you want to bring it up to a boil, reduce the heat, and simmer uncovered, stirring often. For 5 minutes or until the sauce is slightly thickened. At that point, it's time to get it in the jars. Now, when you're water bath canning, one thing to remember is that you do not want to dump out the water that's inside the jars that you use during the warming process, because you need all the water you can get to cover these jars at the end. So I am just using my jar lifter here to dump the water straight back into the canner before pulling out the jars. I'm also going to take just a second here to point out my jar lifter. I am using one that is spring loaded, so it's a little bit easier to use than the traditional like scissor style jar lifter. If you are somebody that has a hard time with your hands or just wants to make it a little bit easier, I'll make sure to link this down below. But I do keep around the old school style just in case one were to break. I never want to be in the middle of a canning project and have a malfunction of my jar lifter because that makes things increasingly difficult. So now that I have the first 2 jars filled, I am debubbling. They need 1/2 inch of headspace. So I'm flipping over my debubbler here just to go ahead and measure down to the exact proper amount of headspace for the jars. Now, this little debubble tool does have little stair steps, so you can see marked on there where your quarter, half, 3/4 inch, and 1 inch of headspace will be. This is very, very handy for those who want to be exactly precise when canning. I don't use it when I'm doing the 1 inch, as I mentioned in my carnitas video, because I know where that mark is on the jar line. But for anything else, I do like the extra security of going back and making sure my headspace is exactly correct. Again, I am wiping my jar rims with vinegar. I know some just use water, but I personally like vinegar to go ahead and get everything super clean before adding my flats and then the rings. Now, I know several of you mentioned last time you were super happy that I gave you the tip on throwing away any rings that didn't go on super easily. I will say, I just really want to drive that home. If you have any rings that are giving you trouble, get rid of them now. It will save you so much frustration when your jars come out and are not sealed properly. You need that applied even pressure, and that's what a ring in good condition will do for you. This recipe says it makes 4 pints of the sloppy joe starter, but I usually find that I'm a little bit shy of what the recipe actually calls for. So I did go ahead and warm up a 1/2 pint jar as well. With that said, once I got the first one filled up, I tried to fill the second one. It was actually more than a 1/2 pint in the end. So I did not pull out that 1/2 pint jar and put it on the shelf. One reason for that is because last time y'all really wanted to know how those pork carnitas turned out. And I thought it would be a really cool thing to go ahead and just jump forward at the end and show you exactly what this final product was. With the jar not reaching the space that I needed to safely can it, I decided to go ahead and just put a lid on it and throw it in the refrigerator so I can pull it out in a couple days and make those sloppy joes for my family, give it a taste test so I could give you the final results before we're done here. Once all of the jars are ready to go, all I have to do is get them in the canner and then top with boiling water. Now, if you are using a water bath canner over on the stove, chances are you probably already have a full pot simmering, so you'll be good to go. But with this water bath canner, I am topping off because when warming jars, you're only to add that first 3 quarts of water. Once they're in there, it's time to go ahead and get that lid put on. You do just twist it into place just like an Instapot, which is kind of why I like it. And then go ahead and lock that green handle, pushing start. In the beginning, I went ahead and set 25 minutes on my canner. Reason being, I am in an area where the altitude is just above the range, like really barely above the range, for the timing suggested in the ball book. Now, this is sped up time. It does properly count down by the minute, but I wanted to show you just exactly how this works. Once it gets all the way down to 1 minute and then done, it switches into a cool mode automatically, which means not only do you not have to mind the clock, but you don't have to mind the burner either. You can, of course, hear the boiling water, which is why I gave you that sound. So I knew that it was being canned safely. And once the 5 minutes of cool was out, all you have to do is remove the jars, setting them out to cool for at least 24 hours before getting them on the shelf. Notice the position of my jar lifter here. I'm as low on the glass as I actually can be to make sure to not disturb those lids. My jar sealed perfectly, and here we are a couple days later making up the sloppy joes. I did make some homemade Hawaiian rolls to go with them, which were absolutely delicious in flavor, although I messed up. And if you want to see a bit more of that, make sure to subscribe and come back next week where I show you these rolls in my last edition of my pantry challenge. But these sloppy joes were great and Canuary has been amazing. So thanks again to Lisa and 4 Jars. I hope to see you back here again next year. Happy Canuary, friends.